Lubang Island, Philippines. February 20, 1974. A man walks through dense jungle foliage, moving with the practiced silence of someone who has spent decades avoiding detection. He is 52 years old. His uniform, once the crisp khaki of the Imperial Japanese Army, hangs in tatters from a frame that has grown lean and weathered. The fabric has been patched so many times with plant fibers and stolen cloth that almost nothing remains of the original material. Where buttons once fastened, there are now wooden toggles carved from branch wood. Where pockets once held ammunition and rations, there are now pouches sewn from banana leaves and sealed with tree sap. His rifle, a Type 99 Arisaka, shows signs of meticulous care despite 3 decades in tropical humidity. The metal still gleams, wiped clean each day with leaves that leave no residue. The mechanism still functions, tested and retested in a ritual that has been performed over 10,000 times. The stock bears carvings, small marks that denote significant events, a calendar of combat that only he can read. Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda has been fighting World War II for 29 years after it ended. He believes the war never ended. He believes the surrender was American propaganda. He believes his mission continues. And today, like every day for the past 10,642 days, he wakes before dawn, checks his perimeter, and prepares for combat operations against an enemy that no longer exists in a war that ended before most of the island's current residents were born. The jungle around him is not the same jungle he entered in December 1944. The trees have grown taller. New species have taken root. Paths he once knew have vanished under vegetation. But Onoda's internal map remains precise. He knows every ridge, every water source, every cave, every escape route. This knowledge has kept him alive. This knowledge has kept him free. This knowledge has kept him faithful to orders given 3 decades ago by a commanding officer he assumes is still waiting for his report. The morning air carries sounds that would confuse a visitor to this island. Tractors grinding up distant hills, their engines straining against inclines that were once only traveled by foot. Motorcycles on newly paved roads, their 2-stroke engines producing a whine that cuts through the jungle's natural chorus. The electronic chirp of transistor radios playing music that didn't exist in 1945, melodies that would be incomprehensible to someone whose last exposure to popular culture was a military march. Dogs barking in villages where once there were only scattered farms. Church bells marking hours in a calendar system that has changed multiple times since Onoda went into the jungle. But Onoda has learned to interpret these sounds through the lens of his mission. The tractors are enemy equipment, mechanized forces preparing the island for military use. The roads are enemy supply lines, evidence of a permanent occupation infrastructure. The music is enemy morale-boosting broadcasts, psychological operations designed to pacify the local population. The dogs are guard animals. The bells are signals. Everything confirms what he already knows. The war continues. The enemy occupies this territory. His orders remain in effect. The framework is airtight because the framework interprets all evidence as confirmation. There is no fact that can penetrate this logic. There is no observation that can challenge this truth. His orders were simple. Carry out guerrilla warfare. Never surrender. Never take your own life. Wait for the Imperial Japanese Army to return. Those orders came from Major Yoshimi Taniguchi in December 1944, delivered personally, with full awareness that Onoda and his team might wait months or even years for relief. Neither man imagined it would be decades. Onoda had been trained specifically for this type of mission. He was an intelligence officer, educated at the Nakano School, the Imperial Army's Academy for Guerrilla Warfare, Intelligence Gathering and Unconventional Operations. The school, established in 1938 in a compound west of Tokyo, operated in near total secrecy. Students were selected based on intelligence, adaptability, and psychological resilience. The curriculum was unlike any other military training in Japan. While regular army training emphasized obedience to orders and unit cohesion, Nakano School taught independent thinking, improvisation, and the ability to function alone for extended periods. Students learned cryptography, radio operation, sabotage techniques, and psychological warfare. They studied enemy propaganda methods not to avoid them, but to recognize and exploit them. They learned how to create false identities, how to interrogate prisoners, how to recruit and manage guerrilla forces. But most importantly, they learned how to maintain mission focus regardless of circumstances. The training included psychological conditioning designed to make students immune to propaganda, resistant to despair, and capable of functioning alone for extended periods. Instructors would subject students to elaborate deception scenarios, presenting them with false evidence of Japanese defeat, fabricated surrender orders, and staged rescue operations designed to test their commitment. Students who wavered were dismissed. Students who remained steadfast graduated. Onoda had excelled at every test, every deception scenario, every psychological pressure point. He had demonstrated the perfect mindset for long-term guerrilla operations. The conditioning worked better than anyone anticipated. In 1944, the war was turning against Japan. American forces were island hopping across the Pacific, moving closer to the home islands with each campaign. The Philippines, recaptured by MacArthur's forces, represented a strategic barrier between American power and the Japanese homeland. The Imperial Army knew it couldn't hold the major islands, but it could make liberation expensive. It could tie down American resources. It could buy time for the homeland to prepare defenses. That was where officers like Onoda came in. Small teams of intelligence personnel would remain behind enemy lines, conducting guerrilla operations, gathering intelligence, creating uncertainty and cost for occupation forces. Onoda's team was assigned to Lubang Island, a small landmass approximately 75 miles southwest of Manila. The island held an airfield, several villages, and strategic high ground overlooking shipping lanes. His mission was to prevent American use of the airfield and to continue operations until relieved by Imperial forces. When Onoda arrived on Lubang in December 1944, he came with 3 other soldiers. Private Yuichi Akatsu, Private First Class Shoichi Shimada, and Corporal Shoichi Yokoi. All were trained in guerrilla tactics. All understood the mission. All received the same orders. Never surrender. The 4 men watched as conventional Japanese forces withdrew from Lubang ahead of the American advance. They watched as the war moved on without them. And they prepared to wait. The American liberation of Lubang came in February 1945. Forces swept through the island, engaged Japanese defenders, secured strategic positions. Onoda and his team observed from the jungle. They saw American soldiers. They saw American equipment. They saw American victory. And they waited for the counterattack that Japanese doctrine promised would come. They waited for the Imperial Navy to return. They waited for reinforcements. They waited for the strategic situation to reverse. The reversal never came. But Onoda's orders never changed. In the first months after the American occupation of Lubang, Onoda and his team conducted active operations. They burned rice stockpiles to deny them to occupation forces. They cut telegraph lines. They observed American movements. They stayed hidden. This was textbook guerrilla warfare, exactly as they'd been trained. The 4 men lived off the land, hunting wild pigs and cattle, gathering coconuts and fruit, fishing in streams. They rationed ammunition carefully. They maintained weapons meticulously. They prepared for the long campaign they knew was coming. The isolation was not immediate. In 1945, several dozen Japanese holdouts remained scattered across Lubang's interior, former soldiers who had either refused to surrender or had never received word of Japan's defeat. Onoda occasionally encountered other holdouts, but these encounters grew less frequent as months passed. Some surrendered to Filipino authorities. Some died from disease or accidents. Some simply disappeared into the jungle and were never seen again. Onoda remained convinced these men had abandoned their duty. He had orders. Clear orders. Delivered personally by a superior officer. Those orders contained no time limit. They contained no conditions for surrender. They stated explicitly that he was to continue guerrilla operations until relieved by Imperial forces. Therefore he would continue. The logic was airtight. The commitment was absolute. The alternatives were unthinkable. In October 1945, Onoda and his team found a leaflet. It was printed in Japanese, carried what appeared to be official seals, and contained a message that changed everything for 3 of the 4 men. The leaflet announced that Japan had surrendered. It stated that Emperor Hirohito had issued a ceasefire order. It instructed all Japanese military personnel to lay down arms and surrender to Allied authorities. The leaflet even included a photograph of what appeared to be Japanese officials signing surrender documents aboard an American battleship. The image showed men in formal attire, military uniforms, civilian suits. American officers stood in the background. The composition looked official. The photograph quality was excellent. Too excellent. That was the problem. Private Akatsu looked at the leaflet carefully. He was 23 years old, the youngest of the group. He had joined the army in 1943, had basic infantry training, had never seen combat before Lubang. He wanted to believe the leaflet. He wanted to go home. He wanted to see his family, his village, his life. He wanted the war to be over. The photograph of the surrender signing looked authentic to his eyes. The Japanese text looked genuine. The official seals appeared correct. He turned to Onoda and asked what they should do. His voice carried hope and fear in equal measure. Onoda studied the leaflet with the trained eye of an intelligence officer. He noted the paper quality, too clean for wartime conditions, too white, too crisp. Real military documents in 1945 were printed on whatever paper could be found, often yellowish, sometimes with visible wood pulp. This paper was pristine. He noted the printing quality, too professional for field conditions. The characters were perfectly formed, the alignment was exact, the photograph reproduction was sharp. This required industrial printing equipment. He noted the message itself, too convenient for the Americans. Of course the occupying power would want Japanese holdouts to believe the war was over. Of course they would fabricate documents to achieve that goal. The Americans knew they couldn't defeat Japanese troops in direct combat, so they were trying to defeat them psychologically. This was textbook psychological warfare. This was exactly what the Nakano School had prepared him to encounter. He explained this to his men. He reminded them of their training. He reminded them that the Nakano School had taught them specifically to expect this type of propaganda. He reminded them of their orders. And he told them that anyone who believed this leaflet was failing in his duty to the emperor. Private Akatsu nodded. He didn't believe it was propaganda. But he was a private and Onoda was an officer. Military hierarchy was absolute. He would follow orders. More leaflets appeared over the following months. They contained increasingly specific information. Photographs of Emperor Hirohito in civilian clothes. Announcements of the occupation of Japan. News of the Tokyo trials. Descriptions of the new Japanese constitution. Each leaflet was more detailed, more specific, more persuasive. And each time Onoda's analysis was the same. Propaganda. Enemy psychological operations. Attempts to deceive them into abandoning their posts. The four men conducted raids on Filipino farms. They needed food. They needed supplies. They took what they needed and withdrew before authorities could respond. These raids created tension with local residents. The Filipinos had welcomed liberation from Japanese occupation in 1945. They had celebrated the end of the war. And now they found themselves being raided by Japanese soldiers who refused to accept that the war was over. In September 1949, after 4 years of isolation, Private Akatsu made a decision. He separated from the group. He didn't announce his intention to surrender, knowing Onoda would try to stop him. He simply disappeared one night during a movement between camps. 6 months later, Akatsu walked out of the jungle and surrendered to Filipino authorities. He told them about Onoda and the other two holdouts. He told them about their camps, their movements, their state of mind. He told them they believed the war was still ongoing. The Philippine government launched search operations. Soldiers entered the jungle with loudspeakers, broadcasting messages in Japanese. Family members sent letters that were dropped from aircraft. The messages all said the same thing. The war is over. Come home. You are not in danger. Your families are waiting. Onoda, Shimada, and Yokoi heard these broadcasts. They found the letters. And they were more convinced than ever that they were right to resist. The enemy was getting desperate. The enemy was using family members in propaganda broadcast. The enemy was conducting psychological warfare operations on a massive scale. This meant the enemy was afraid. This meant the Imperial Army was still fighting somewhere. This meant their mission mattered. The 1950s brought changes to Lubang Island that would have shaken anyone's worldview. Roads were paved. Power lines were installed. Schools were built. The island's economy transitioned from subsistence agriculture to commercial farming. Tourism began to develop. Transistor radios became common in Filipino households. The sounds of modern life drifted into the jungle, but they reached men who had no context for interpreting them. Onoda, Shimada, and Yokoi adapted their tactics. They became more cautious. They reduced the frequency of raids. They moved camps more often. They perfected the art of invisibility. 4 months at a time, they had no contact with the outside world, living entirely off the jungle, avoiding all human settlements, maintaining discipline and readiness for the day when imperial forces would return. In 1952, the three men found newspapers. Japanese newspapers. Current newspapers with dates, photographs, and detailed stories about life in post-war Japan. The newspapers described a country transformed. Democracy replacing military government. Allied occupation ending. Japan participating in international organizations. Economic growth beginning. Television broadcast starting. Consumer goods becoming available. A nation at peace, rebuilding, moving forward. The newspapers contained advertisements for products that hadn't existed in 1945. Refrigerators. Washing machines. Cameras. The prices were listed in yen denominations that made no sense based on pre-war currency values. Photographs showed Tokyo streets filled with cars, buildings under construction, people in modern clothing. One newspaper included an interview with Emperor Hirohito, speaking about reconstruction and peace. The emperor was wearing civilian clothes. Not military uniform. Civilian clothes. Onoda read these newspapers thoroughly. He spent hours examining every page, every photograph, every article. He was an intelligence officer. He analyzed information professionally. And his conclusion, reached through careful analysis and reinforced by years of conditioning, was that these newspapers were the most sophisticated propaganda yet. The Americans had obviously hired Japanese collaborators to produce false newspapers that would convince holdouts to surrender. The detail was impressive. The effort was remarkable. The Americans must have employed entire teams of Japanese linguists, designers, and photographers to create these documents. The photographs looked authentic. The layout matched pre-war Japanese newspaper styles. The writing style was natural, colloquial. But the fundamental premise was impossible. Japan could not have been defeated. The emperor was divine. The Japanese spirit was indomitable. The idea that Japan would surrender, would accept occupation, would allow American forces on sacred soil, was literally inconceivable within Onoda's worldview. Therefore these newspapers must be false. The logic was circular, but it was perfect. The conclusion was predetermined, but it was unshakable. This logic loop, reinforced by years of isolation and commitment to mission, made Onoda functionally unreachable by conventional means. Every piece of evidence that contradicted his worldview became evidence that his worldview was correct. Every attempt to communicate with him became proof that communication was dangerous. Every offer of safe passage home became proof that the enemy feared him. The raids continued. In 1954, Onoda and his team burned 15 tons of rice belonging to a Filipino farmer. They shot at fishermen who came too close to their territory. They set fire to a fuel depot. These were military operations, conducted with military precision, against an enemy that they believed was occupying Japanese territory. The fact that the enemy was Filipino civilians who had been born after the war ended never penetrated their understanding. In their minds, everyone on the island was either an enemy combatant or a collaborator with the occupation forces. The Philippine government intensified efforts to bring the holdouts in. Search parties entered the jungle regularly. But the searchers were dealing with men who had spent a decade perfecting evasion techniques, men who knew every trail and hiding spot, men who treated every search party as an enemy patrol to be avoided or ambushed. The searchers found abandoned campsites. They found the remains of fires. They found evidence of recent presence. But they never found the men. In May 1954, the situation escalated. Shimada and Onoda were moving through jungle near the settlement of Gontan when they encountered a Filipino patrol. What exactly happened next is unclear. Onoda's account suggests the patrol spotted them and opened fire. Filipino accounts suggest the holdouts fired first. What is clear is that in the exchange of gunfire that followed, Private First Class Shimada was killed. Onoda and Yokoi buried Shimada in the jungle, marking the grave with stones so they could report the location when they were finally relieved. Now there were two men a decade into their mission with no communication from headquarters, no supplies, no reinforcements, and no way to know that their war had ended in 1945. The death shook them, but it did not change their mission. If anything, it hardened their resolve. Shimada had died in combat. He had maintained his duty until the end. He had not surrendered. He had honored the emperor. This was how a soldier should die. And Onoda and Yokoi would do the same when their time came. The years after Shimada's death brought a subtle shift. The raids became less frequent. The camps became more remote. The two men spoke less, conserving energy, maintaining routines, existing in a state somewhere between military discipline and primal survival. They were no longer conducting an active guerrilla campaign. They were maintaining presence. They were not surrendering. That was enough. The jungle changed them. Onoda's face became weathered, carved by sun and wind into something harder than it had been at 22. His hands developed thick calluses. His hearing sharpened. His night vision improved. His body adapted to chronic near-starvation, learning to function on minimal calories, to move efficiently, to conserve strength. He became, in some fundamental way, no longer entirely human in the way civilization defines humanity. He became a jungle creature, a survivor, a believer waiting for a promise that would never be kept. In 1958, Yokoi began to waver. He was 42 years old. He had been in the jungle for 14 years. He was tired. He wanted to see his family. He wanted to sleep without fear. He wanted to eat without rationing. He told Onoda that maybe, just maybe, some of what they'd heard was true. Maybe the war really was over. Maybe they should consider surrendering. Onoda's response was cold and absolute. They had orders. Those orders had not been countermanded by a legitimate authority. Until their commanding officer personally relieved them of duty, they would continue their mission. There was no discussion to be had. There was no doubt to be entertained. There was only duty. Yokoi never raised the subject again. In 1959, the two men separated. The accounts differ on why. Onoda claims it was a tactical decision, that splitting up would make them harder to track. Others speculate that Yokoi simply couldn't maintain the rigorous pace Onoda demanded. Whatever the reason, after 15 years together, the two men went their separate ways in the jungle, each to continue his solitary war. Onoda was now alone. Truly alone. The only person on Earth who believed that World War II was still being fought in the mountains of Lubang Island. He was 37 years old. He would remain alone in this belief for 15 more years. Alone, Onoda developed routines so precise they bordered on ritual. Wake before dawn, always in darkness, never using light that could be spotted. Check weapons immediately, running hands over every part of the rifle mechanism, feeling for rust, for weakness, for any sign of degradation. Survey perimeter, moving in a pattern that changed daily but followed principles that remained constant. Plan movement for the day, considering weather, enemy activity patterns, resource needs. Gather food, using techniques refined over decades, knowing which fruits were safe, which plants were edible, which streams were clean. Maintain equipment, a process that consumed hours each day, cleaning, repairing, improvising solutions to problems that would have been trivial with proper tools but were life-threatening without them. Monitor enemy activity, watching from concealed positions as the island's residents went about their lives, interpreting their movements through a military lens that saw threat in every action. Document observations, maintaining meticulous mental notes about patrol patterns, schedule changes, infrastructure developments. Sleep lightly, always ready to move, never in the same location twice, never comfortable, never truly resting. Repeat. Every day. For years. The routines kept him sane in a way that external observers might question but that internal logic demanded. The routines kept him mission-focused when mission focus was all that stood between him and the crushing recognition that he might be wrong. The routines prevented the crushing weight of isolation from breaking him, from forcing him to confront questions that had no acceptable answers. He spoke to himself. Not constantly but regularly, in patterns that felt almost like conversation. Conversations with his commanding officer, rehearsing the report he would deliver upon relief, detailing enemy strength, terrain changes, supply routes, tactical opportunities. Conversations with the Emperor, explaining his continued service, reaffirming his loyalty, describing the sacrifices made in service of the divine will. Conversations with Shimada and Yokoi, reviewing tactical decisions, debating choices, analyzing outcomes as if his companions were still present to respond. The talking kept language alive in his mind, prevented it from deteriorating into grunts and gestures. It kept him connected to his identity as a Japanese officer, to his role as a soldier, to his purpose as a guardian of territory that existed only in his conception of military reality. He celebrated holidays. New Year's Day, the Emperor's birthday, major battle commemorations. On these days he would wear his best remaining uniform pieces, clean his rifle to perfection, and conduct a solitary ceremony, saluting in the direction of Tokyo, reaffirming his oath to the Emperor. These ceremonies were not performances. There was no one to see them. They were genuine expressions of a faith that remained absolute despite 20 years without confirmation, 20 years without contact, 20 years without evidence that anyone remembered he existed. The Philippine government, meanwhile, had not forgotten. In 1965, they launched another major search operation, hoping to finally locate the remaining holdout they knew was somewhere on Lubang. Search parties combed the interior. Aircraft dropped leaflets. Loudspeakers broadcast messages. They found nothing. Onoda watched the search operations from concealed positions. He observed the searchers' tactics. He noted their equipment. He planned evasion routes. And he concluded that this massive operation proved how important his mission had become. The enemy was committing significant resources to finding him. This meant he was disrupting their plans. This meant his guerrilla campaign was working. This meant he needed to continue. The isolation had a cost. Onoda's remaining teeth began to rot. His vision started to fail. Chronic infections became routine. Skin conditions developed from constant exposure to jungle humidity. His body was slowly breaking down. But his mind remained locked in October 1945, in the moment he received his orders, in the absolute certainty that those orders defined his purpose and his duty. The 1960s saw Lubang Island transform dramatically. Television came to the Philippines. Commercial air travel expanded. The Vietnam War brought American military presence back to Southeast Asia. Tourists began visiting Lubang. Young Filipinos who had been born long after World War II reached adulthood with no memory of the Japanese occupation, no understanding of the conflict that had once consumed the Pacific. Onoda continued his mission in a world that had moved on. He raided farms less frequently now, partly because he needed less food, partly because he had refined his ability to live off the jungle. He avoided human contact almost completely. Months would pass without him seeing another person. This was his choice. This was his discipline. This was his duty. In 1972, 27 years after the end of World War II, something remarkable happened on Guam. Local farmers discovered a man living in a cave in the island's interior. He was emaciated, incoherent, and wearing the remains of a Japanese military uniform. He was identified as Sergeant Shoichi Yokoi, formerly of the Imperial Japanese Army, who had been hiding in the Guam jungle since 1944. The news of Yokoi's discovery spread worldwide. For the first time, people realized that Japanese holdouts were not just legend but real. That soldiers trained in guerrilla warfare and conditioned to never surrender might actually have maintained their missions for decades. That somewhere in the Pacific, other holdouts might still be waiting for orders that would never come. The Japanese government took notice. Officials realized that if Yokoi had survived 28 years on Guam, others might still be alive on other islands. They compiled lists of soldiers who had never returned, cross-referenced with reports of holdout sightings, and identified Lubang Island as a likely location. Records showed that Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda had been assigned there in 1944 and had never been confirmed killed or captured. In 1972, the Japanese government sent Onoda's brother and sister to Lubang. They carried letters from Onoda's mother. They recorded messages. They pleaded for him to come home. These messages were broadcast throughout the island for weeks. Onoda heard them. He heard his brother's voice. He heard his sister's voice. He heard details that only family members would know. And he concluded it was the most sophisticated propaganda operation yet. The enemy had obviously interviewed collaborators who knew his family. The enemy had hired actors to play his siblings. The recordings were designed to exploit his emotional attachments and trick him into surrendering. The fact that the voices sounded authentic proved how desperate the enemy had become. After 27 years, they were finally pulling out all the stops to capture him. He did not respond to the broadcast. He did not approach the searchers. He remained hidden, convinced that responding would mean capture, interrogation, and dishonor. The search parties eventually withdrew. The Japanese officials returned home, frustrated but not surprised. They knew that a man trained at Nakano School, conditioned to resist interrogation, living in isolation for 3 decades, would not be easily persuaded by conventional appeals. They needed something different. They needed someone who could give Onoda what he believed he needed. They needed his commanding officer. In February 1974, a 24-year-old Japanese college dropout named Norio Suzuki arrived on Lubang Island. Suzuki was a wanderer, an adventurer, someone who rejected conventional career paths in favor of unique experiences. He had told friends he wanted to find 3 things: a panda, a yeti, and Lieutenant Onoda. He'd already found the panda. The yeti remained elusive, but he believed he could find Onoda. Suzuki had no special training. He had no government authorization. He had no plan beyond entering the jungle and looking for signs of the holdout. What he had was an openness that professional searchers lacked. He wasn't trying to capture Onoda. He wasn't trying to convince him to surrender. He simply wanted to meet him, to talk with him, to understand him. For 4 days, Suzuki hiked through Lubang's interior, calling out in Japanese that he was looking for Lieutenant Onoda, that he meant no harm, that he just wanted to talk. He camped in clearings, built fires, made no attempt to hide. He was, by all standards, doing everything wrong if he wanted to avoid being seen. But that was exactly his strategy. He wanted to be seen. On February 20, 1974, Onoda observed Suzuki's camp from a concealed position. He watched this strange young man who seemed utterly unconcerned with tactical security. Who was this person? Not a soldier. Not a searcher. Not a threat. Someone new. Someone different. That night, Onoda walked into Suzuki's camp. He emerged from darkness into firelight, rifle ready, appearing like a ghost from an earlier age, a figure that seemed to belong to a different timeline entirely. Suzuki looked up and saw a man who embodied every description he'd heard. The weathered face, carved by 3 decades of sun and stress into something resembling carved wood more than human flesh. The patched uniform, held together by determination and improvisation. The meticulously maintained rifle, showing care that bordered on worship. The bearing of someone who had lived in tension for 3 decades, muscles always coiled, eyes always scanning, mind always calculating threat and opportunity. Lieutenant Onoda? Suzuki asked, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. Onoda lowered his rifle slightly, just a few degrees, enough to signal he wouldn't fire immediately but not enough to suggest trust. The young man spoke Japanese. Not the Japanese of American psychological warfare broadcasts, which always carried subtle pronunciation errors. Not the Japanese of Filipino collaborators, which bore the influence of Tagalog rhythms. This was native Tokyo Japanese, the dialect of home. The young man used his rank correctly. The young man showed no fear, which was unusual in itself. Every other person Onoda had encountered in 3 decades had shown fear. This was unusual. This required investigation. Who are you? Onoda asked. His voice was rough, unpracticed at conversation, the words coming slowly as if his throat needed to remember how to shape them for another person to hear. My name is Norio Suzuki. I came from Japan to find you. I'm not military. I'm not government. I'm just interested. They talked through the night. Suzuki asked about the war, about the mission, about survival techniques. He didn't challenge. He didn't argue. He simply listened with genuine curiosity. Onoda, starved for conversation after years of isolation, found himself responding in ways he hadn't anticipated. He explained his mission in detail. He explained his orders, their clarity, their continued validity. He explained why he could not surrender without direct command from his superior officer. He explained the logic that had sustained him, the framework that had kept him alive and focused. Suzuki listened without interruption. He nodded. He asked clarifying questions. And gradually Onoda realized something remarkable. This young man believed him. Not believed that the war was continuing, but believed that Onoda genuinely held these convictions, that the mission was real to him, that the commitment was authentic. Suzuki asked questions that others hadn't thought to ask. He didn't argue about whether the war was over. He didn't try to convince Onoda that he was wrong. He simply tried to understand Onoda's position. And in understanding he found the key. Onoda needed orders. Not persuasion. Not evidence. Not arguments. Orders. From the officer who had given him the original mission. That officer was Major Yoshimi Taniguchi. If Taniguchi came to Lubang and ordered Onoda to stand down, Onoda would comply. Not before. Suzuki left Lubang within days. He returned to Japan and contacted government officials. He told them what Onoda needed. He told them how to end this 30-year mission. He gave them the key. On March 9, 1974, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi stepped off a plane at Lubang Island. He was 74 years old. He had retired from military service in 1945. He had spent 3 decades as a civilian working in business, living a normal post-war life. He had often thought about the young intelligence officer he'd sent to Lubang in December 1944, had wondered what became of him, had assumed he'd died in combat or surrendered with other Japanese forces. Now he was being asked to return to uniform, to travel to a remote Philippine island, to officially relieve an officer who had been following his orders for 30 years. The absurdity was almost overwhelming. But Taniguchi understood his responsibility. He had given those orders. He had trained Onoda to follow them absolutely. He had to be the one to end this. Philippine and Japanese officials had arranged a meeting point. They had contacted Onoda through Suzuki, who had returned to the jungle briefly to deliver the message. Lieutenant Onoda was to report to his commanding officer at a designated location on March 9 for new orders. Onoda prepared carefully. He cleaned his rifle. He wore the most complete pieces of his uniform. He gathered his documents, his records, his sword. He would report as regulations required. He would present his weapons. He would deliver his situation report. And then he would receive new orders. At 10 a.m. on March 9, 1974, Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda walked out of the jungle for the first time in 29 years. He wore the remains of his uniform, every piece carefully cleaned and arranged according to regulations that had been obsolete for 3 decades. The tunic hung loose on his frame, but he wore it with the posture of a man reporting for duty. He carried his rifle at port arms, the position proper for an officer moving through friendly territory. His sword hung at his side, its grip wrapped in cloth he had woven himself from plant fibers. He maintained the bearing of an officer on duty, back straight, eyes forward, every movement deliberate and controlled. He saluted sharply, the gesture precise and formal. Major Taniguchi returned the salute, his own movements slower, his body older but his military bearing still present beneath decades of civilian life. Taniguchi looked at the man standing before him. He had last seen Lieutenant Onoda in December 1944, a young intelligence officer eager to prove himself, confident in his training, believing absolutely in the mission he had been assigned. Now he saw something else. A man who had aged 3 decades in the harshest circumstances imaginable. A man who had remained faithful to orders long after those orders had ceased to have meaning. A man who deserved to hear what Taniguchi had come to say, even if those words came 29 years too late. The official relief ceremony lasted approximately 5 minutes, though each second seemed to stretch. Taniguchi read the orders aloud, his voice carrying across the small clearing where Filipino and Japanese officials stood witnessing this end to a war that had ended for them long ago. Orders from the Japanese government. Orders from the Emperor. Orders that officially relieved Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda of his duties on Lubang Island and directed him to return to Japan. The war was over. His mission was complete. He was released from his obligation. The words were formal, bureaucratic, military. They carried the weight of authority that Onoda had been waiting 3 decades to hear. Onoda stood at attention throughout. His face showed no emotion. His eyes remained fixed on a point beyond Taniguchi's shoulder, as regulations demanded. When Taniguchi finished, Onoda saluted again, acknowledged the orders in the proper form, and began the formal surrender of his weapons. He handed over his rifle, still functional after 3 decades, its mechanism clean, its barrel true. He handed over his sword, still sharp enough to cut through bamboo in a single stroke. He handed over ammunition, carefully counted, each round accounted for. He handed over grenades, their mechanism still intact despite years of humidity. He handed over documents, maps he had drawn, observations he had recorded, intelligence reports he had prepared for the relief force that had never come. Then, for the first time in 29 years, Hiroo Onoda allowed himself to believe that World War II might actually be over. The belief came slowly, not in a moment but in a gradual loosening of certainties that had seemed absolute. The framework that had sustained him began to dissolve. The mission that had defined him ceased to exist. And in that absence, questions emerged that he had spent 3 decades not asking. Questions about what it all meant. Questions about what he had lost. Questions about what came next. The man who returned to Japan in March 1974 was not the man who had left in December 1944. Onoda was 52 years old, but he felt older, felt as if he had lived several lifetimes in the space between. The Japan he remembered was gone, replaced by something he couldn't quite recognize or accept. The Imperial Japan of military glory and divine emperor, the Japan he had served with absolute devotion, had been replaced by a democratic, pacifist nation that had chosen economic growth over martial spirit. The emperor, whom Onoda had served with absolute devotion, whom he had believed divine, was now a constitutional figurehead who had renounced divinity in 1946, standing before his people and declaring himself human. The values that had sustained Onoda in the jungle, duty, honor, sacrifice, absolute loyalty, were values that Japan itself had abandoned or transformed into something he no longer recognized. Young people questioned authority. Workers prioritized wages over service. The military was constrained by constitutional restrictions. Everything had changed. Everything he had fought to preserve had already been lost before he emerged from the jungle. The reception was mixed and complicated. Some Japanese hailed Onoda as a hero, a symbol of loyalty and dedication in an age they perceived as lacking both. They saw in him the old Japan, the Japan of samurai values and absolute commitment. Others saw him as an anachronism, a relic of a past that Japan had worked desperately hard to overcome and move beyond. The militarism that had led to war, to defeat, to atomic bombs, was something modern Japan actively rejected. Onoda represented everything they had tried to leave behind. The media coverage was intense and invasive. Cameras followed him everywhere. Reporters asked questions he didn't know how to answer, questions about feelings, about regrets, about what it was like to be wrong for 3 decades. Onoda found himself navigating a world of television cameras, press conferences, and public expectations that he couldn't understand and didn't want. He had spent 30 years in silence, in isolation, in absolute certainty. Now he was surrounded by noise, by crowds, by doubt. There was also the matter of the crimes. During his 30 years on Lubang, Onoda had killed approximately 30 Filipino civilians and wounded over 100 others. These were people farming their land, fishing in streams, going about their lives. To Onoda they had been enemy combatants or collaborators. To their families, they were victims of a soldier who refused to accept that the war was over. The Philippine government pardoned Onoda. President Ferdinand Marcos understood that prosecuting a man who had genuinely believed he was following orders would accomplish nothing. The pardon allowed Onoda to visit Lubang, to meet with families of those he'd killed, to apologize for the pain he'd caused. These meetings were difficult. How do you apologize for taking someone's father, someone's brother, in service of a mission that was 30 years obsolete? Onoda struggled with civilian life. The discipline that had sustained him in the jungle became a liability in modern Japan. He couldn't adapt to the casualness of post-war society. He couldn't accept the disrespect young people showed toward traditions. He couldn't reconcile the Japan he'd served with the Japan that actually existed. In 1975 he emigrated to Brazil, where he bought a cattle ranch and lived in semi-isolation for the next 50 years. He married. He wrote books about his experience. He occasionally returned to Japan to give lectures about loyalty, duty, and survival. But he never fully left the jungle. That man who had believed absolutely in a mission, who had given 3 decades to an illusion, remained somewhere in the mountains of Lubang Island. Before he died in 2014 at the age of 91, Onoda reflected on his 30 years alone. He never expressed regret for following orders. He never apologized for his commitment. What he did express was something more complicated, a sense that perhaps the world he believed in had never existed even in 1944. That perhaps the Imperial Japan he'd served was itself a propaganda construct, no more real than the propaganda he'd spent decades rejecting. The last of the Japanese holdouts passed away in January 2014. His funeral was attended by Japanese officials, Brazilian friends, and a handful of people who remembered World War II firsthand. They buried him with military honors, playing Kimigeo, the Japanese national anthem, as his coffin was lowered into the ground. But the burial felt incomplete, because the real Hiroo Onoda, the man who had lived with absolute conviction in a mission that defined his existence, was already buried somewhere in the mountains of Lubang Island. That man had died on March 9, 1974, when his commanding officer read the orders that ended a war that had been over for 29 years. What walked out of the jungle that day was something else. Someone who had given everything to belief, only to discover that the world had moved on without him. And perhaps that is the real story. Not of a man who wouldn't surrender, but of a man who believed so completely in something that was no longer true that he spent half his life defending a mission that only existed in his mind. And when he finally learned the truth, when the orders came that allowed him to stop fighting, he discovered that the war he'd lost wasn't the one he'd been fighting in the jungle. It was the war against time itself, against change, against the inevitable truth that the world does not wait for anyone, not even those who serve it with perfect loyalty. Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda served his emperor, his nation, and his orders with a devotion that few could match. But the question remains, what do you do when perfect loyalty is given to a cause that no longer exists? When devotion becomes disconnection? When duty becomes delusion? The jungle remembers. The mountains of Lubang still carry the memory of a man who walked among them for 3 decades, believing in a war that ended before he truly understood what he was fighting for. And in that memory, preserved in the silence of the jungle, is a question about faith, duty, and the cost of believing absolutely in something the world has left behind. The war ended on August 15, 1945. For most people. For Hiroo Onoda, it ended on March 9, 1974. And perhaps in some way it never ended at all.